Let's be honest, Clint. You're a relic. Your movies, your tough guy act, it's all a bit tired, isn't it? Maybe it's time to retire. What happens when a Hollywood legend steps onto a stage rigged to tear him down? The Jimmy Kimmel live studio buzzed with anticipation, the audience shifting in their seats, sensing a storm brewing. Clint Eastwood, his face weathered like an old oak, sat across from Jimmy Kimmel, whose grin stretched too wide, like a salesman hiding a trick. Eastwood's latest Western, a gritty tale of redemption, had just hit theaters, and Kimmel, smelling blood, saw a chance to poke the icon. The crowd, a mix of loyal Eastwood fans and curious onlookers, waited, their whispers sharp as knives. Eastwood adjusted his chair, his movements slow, deliberate, like a gunslinger sizing up a foe. Kimmel, pen in hand, tapped the desk, his eyes glinting with mischief. This wasn't just a talk show, it was a battlefield, and both men knew it. Kimmel leaned forward, his voice dripping with fake warmth. "Clint, your new movie, it's all shootouts and dusty trails. Don't you think, at your age, maybe it's time to move on from all that cowboy stuff?" The audience tittered, a few gasps cutting through. Eastwood's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing to slits, like a hawk spotting prey. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch, heavy as a storm cloud. Kimmel, mistaking the pause for weakness, pressed on. "I mean, come on, these films, they glorify violence, right? In today's world, isn't that a bit, well, out of touch?" The jab landed and the crowd stirred, some nodding, others glaring at Kimmel, who basked in the attention, oblivious to the fire he'd just lit. Eastwood leaned back, his hands resting. On his knees, fingers curling slightly, as if gripping an invisible revolver. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, each word a bullet. "You think you know violence, Jimmy? You sit here, cracking jokes, while men like me tell stories of the real cost. My film ain't about glory, it's about sacrifice." The audience hushed, caught by the weight of his words. Kimmel's grin faltered, but he recovered, waving a hand dismissively. "Sacrifice? Clint, it's just entertainment. Nobody's buying that deep stuff anymore. People want fun, not lectures from the Old West." The crowd murmured, split between agreement and unease, as Kimmel's tone turned sharp, his politeness peeling away like cheap paint. Eastwood's gaze locked onto Kimmel, unyielding, like a predator pinning its target. "You call it a lecture? I call it truth. Something you wouldn't know with your fake tears and scripted laughs." The accusation hit like a thunderclap, and the audience gasped, some clapping, others whispering furiously. Kimmel's face reddened, his fingers tightening around his pen, but he forced a laugh, shrill and hollow. "Fake? Clint, I'm real, as it gets. You're the one stuck in the past, selling myths nobody needs." The words were venomous, meant to wound, and they did. Eastwood's knuckles whitened, his calm cracking, but he held his ground, his silence louder than any shout. The tension coiled tighter, the crowd leaning forward, sensing blood in the water. Kimmel, emboldened by the split audience, went for the kill. "Let's be honest, Clint. You're a relic. Your movies, your tough guy act, it's all a bit tired, isn't it? Maybe it's time to retire, let the new blood take over?" The audience erupted, some booing Kimmel, others cheering his audacity. Eastwood's chair creaked as he shifted, his eyes burning with a fury that silenced the room. He hadn't struck back yet, but the air crackled with the promise of a reckoning. Kimmel, smug, leaned back, thinking he'd won the round, unaware he'd just stepped into a trap, set by a man who'd faced down worse than a talk show host. Clint Eastwood's chair scraped the floor, a harsh sound that cut through the audience's murmurs like a blade through cloth. He leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the armrests, his eyes locked on Jimmy Kimmel with the intensity of a man who'd stared down death in a dozen films. The crowd held its breath, their earlier cheers and boos fading into a tense hush as if the room itself feared what was coming. Kimmel, still smirking, twirled his pen, his confidence teetering on arrogance, unaware he'd provoked a lion. Eastwood's silence had been a coiled spring, and now it snapped. "You think I'm a relic?" Eastwood growled, his voice rough as sandpaper, each word deliberate, like stones dropped into a still pond. "I've been telling stories that matter since before you were born, kid. You? You peddle cheap laughs, tearing down men who built this industry." The audience erupted, some clapping wildly, others gasping at the raw edge in his tone. Kimmel's smirk vanished, his face tightening, like a man who'd just been slapped. He opened his mouth, but Eastwood cut him off, his voice rising, sharp as a whip. "You mock my work? My films show the cost of violence, the weight of choices. What do you show? A circus for people who forgot how to think." Kimmel's hand slammed onto the desk, the thud echoing through the studio. His eyes flashed with anger, his voice biting. "Don't lecture me, Clint. Your movies are just noise, old man. Blood, guns, squinting into the sunset. Nobody cares about your so-called truths." The crowd stirred, some booing Kimmel's cruelty, others leaning forward, drawn to the venom. Kimmel pressed on, his words dripping with scorn. "You talk about building the industry? You're just cashing in on nostalgia. Hollywood's moved on, and you're too stubborn to see it." His finger jabbed the air, pointing at Eastwood, as if daring him to strike back. Eastwood's face hardened, his lips curling into a sneer that sent a chill through the room. He stood slowly, his tall frame towering over the set, his presence commanding, like a general facing a mutinous soldier. "Stubborn?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "I'm loyal. Loyal to stories that show what it means to be human. You wouldn't know loyalty if it bit you. You'd sell your own soul for a laugh," the audience roared, the sound swelling like wildfire, as Eastwood's words landed like punches. A woman in the front row clapped so hard her hands shook, while a man beside her whispered, "He's tearing him apart." Kimmel, his face flushed, shot to his feet, his chair skidding backward. He leaned over the desk, his voice shrill, almost desperate. "Soul? Don't talk to me about soul, Clint. You're a has-been, clinging to a world that doesn't exist. My show's real, it's now. You're just a ghost haunting the screen." The insult was vicious, meant to wound, and it did. Eastwood's eyes blazed, his fists clenching at his sides, but he didn't lunge. Instead, he took a step closer, his shadow falling over Kimmel, who flinched, betraying his bravado. The crowd sensed the shift, their whispers growing fevered, as if waiting for the final blow. Eastwood's voice dropped, cold as steel. "You call me a ghost? At least I've got a spine. You're just a shadow, Jimmy, hiding behind your desk, spitting on men better than you." The air in the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio crackled, as if charged with the heat of a desert standoff. Clint Eastwood stood tall, his shadow looming over Jimmy Kimmel, who shrank behind his desk, his earlier bravado crumbling like dry sand. The audience, caught in the grip of Eastwood's words, leaned forward, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing a breaking point. Kimmel's flinch had been brief, but it was enough, a crack in his armor that Eastwood saw and seized. The host's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the desk's edge, his face a mask of forced defiance, but his eyes betrayed fear, like a man who'd taunted a bear and now heard its growl. Eastwood took another step, his boots thudding softly. On the stage, each sound a hammer strike. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, sharp with contempt. "You think you can judge me, Jimmy? You, who's never told a story worth hearing? My films, they're about men who face the dark and come out standing. You just mock them from your cushy chair." The crowd roared, the sound swelling like a tidal wave as fans pounded their hands together, their faces alight with pride. A man in the back shouted, "Tell him, Clint," while others nodded, their loyalty to the legend. Unshaken, Kimmel's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening as he fought to regain control. Scrambling, Kimmel shoved a stack of note cards forward, his voice rising, shrill and jagged. "Face the dark? Spare me, Clint. Your movies are just macho nonsense, feeding egos of guys who think they're cowboys. You're not a hero, you're a prop, dragging us backward." The words were cruel, spat with venom, and the audience gasped, some booing loudly, their anger a living thing. Kimmel's attack was desperate, a wild swing, but it landed, stinging. Eastwood. The legend's face twitched, a flicker of rage crossing his features, like a storm cloud passing over a mountain. He didn't retreat, though, his eyes burning hotter, as if fueled by the insult. "You call me a prop?" Eastwood snarled, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He pointed a finger at Kimmel, steady as a gun barrel. "I've earned every scar, every story with sweat and truth. You? You're the prop, Jimmy, a puppet dancing for ratings, spitting on men who made this town." The audience erupted again, clapping so fiercely the sound shook the set. A woman near the front stood, her hands cupped around her mouth, yelling, "Shame on you, Kimmel!" Kimmel's face flushed deeper, his eyes darting to the crowd, then back to Eastwood, who stood unmoved, a granite wall against the host's flailing. Kimmel, cornered, lurched forward, his voice cracking with fury. "Earned? You're just milking your name, Clint, selling the same tired act. This isn't your Hollywood anymore, it's mine, and I say you're done." The claim was bold, reckless, and the crowd hissed, their disapproval a sharp whip. Eastwood's lips curled into a grim smile, not of amusement, but of certainty, like a man who'd seen his opponent's final mistake. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, audible only to Kimmel and the nearest seats. "You're Hollywood? You don't own this town, kid. You rent it, and your lease is up." The words hung in the air, a promise of ruin as the audience strained to hear, their whispers buzzing like a swarm, sensing the fight was about to tip. Jimmy Kimmel's face drained of color, his eyes wide as Clint Eastwood's whispered words lingered like smoke after a gunshot. The audience, sensing the shift, fell into a restless hush, their earlier shouts replaced by a low hum of expectation, like a crowd awaiting a verdict. Kimmel's hands fumbled with his note cards, scattering them across the desk, a clumsy betrayal of his panic. Eastwood stood rooted, his frame unyielding, his gaze piercing through Kimmel like a nail through wood. The host's bravado had crumbled, and the studio felt smaller, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness the reckoning. Kimmel forced a laugh, sharp and brittle, trying to claw back control. "Lease is up? Nice line, Clint. But this isn't one of your scripts. You can't scare me off my own stage." His voice cracked, betraying his fear, and the crowd stirred, some hissing, others shaking their heads. He pointed at Eastwood, his finger trembling. "You're the one who's finished, old man. Your westerns, your squinting. It's all a joke. Now, go back to your ranch and let real talent run the show." The insult was vicious, a last gasp, but it landed like a stone in mud. The audience booed, their anger swelling, a man in the third row shouting, "You're the joke, Kimmel!" Eastwood's eyes flashed, a spark of fury igniting his calm. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stage, each step a drumbeat of judgment. "Real talent?" he growled, his voice thick with scorn. "You're a vulture, Jimmy, picking at the bones of men who built Hollywood. My films honor the past, the people who fought, bled, loved. You spit on them for a cheap cheer." The crowd exploded, clapping and stomping, their roar shaking the set. A woman waved her fist, yelling, "Give it to him, Clint!" As others joined in, their faces flushed with pride for the legend who refused to bend. Kimmel staggered back, his chair scraping loudly, his face twisting with rage. "Honor? You're delusional, Clint. Your movies are relics, just like you. Nobody needs your dusty morals." He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound jarring, but it only fueled the crowd's disdain. Their boos grew louder, a tidal wave of rejection, as Kimmel's desperation spilled over. He leaned forward, his voice shrill, almost pleading. "This is my show, my time. You don't get to lecture me, you washed-up cowboy." The words were meant to wound, but they sounded hollow, like a child's tantrum against a storm. Eastwood's lips twitched, a faint, deadly smile, like a wolf baring its teeth. He planted his hands on the desk, leaning so close Kimmel flinched, his breath catching. "Washed up?" Eastwood said, his voice a low, searing blade. "I've faced tougher fights than you in my sleep, kid. You're not Hollywood, you're a sideshow, and deep down, you know it. That's why you're screaming." The audience leapt to their feet, their applause a thunderclap, as Eastwood's words struck like a hammer. Kimmel's eyes darted wildly, his hands shaking as the crowd's roar drowned his thoughts, their loyalty to Eastwood a wall he couldn't climb. Jimmy Kimmel slumped against his desk, his shoulders sagging, as if Clint Eastwood's words had drained the fight from him. The audience's applause still echoed, a relentless wave crashing over the stage, their faces alight with admiration, for the man who'd turned the host's taunts to dust. Eastwood stood firm, his hands still planted on the desk, his eyes locked on Kimmel, unyielding, like a judge delivering a final sentence. The studio felt alive, the air thick with the weight of a battle won, as the crowd's cheers pulsed like a heartbeat. Kimmel's note cards lay scattered, a symbol of his shattered confidence, his earlier smirk now a distant memory. Kimmel raised his head, his voice weak, trembling with a mix of anger and defeat. "You think you're untouchable, Clint? You're just a name, a fading star. This stage is mine, and I'll be here long after you're gone." The words were a feeble jab, lacking venom, and the crowd jeered, their voices sharp, cutting through his plea. A man in the front row stood shouting, "Sit down, Kimmel!" as others joined in, their rejection a chorus of disdain. Kimmel's eyes flickered, searching the audience for support, but found only scorn, their loyalty to Eastwood a fortress he couldn't breach. Eastwood straightened, his frame towering, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He stepped back, his boots deliberate, each thud a marker of his victory. "Your stage?" he said, his voice calm but searing, like a blade cooled in fire. "You're a tenant, Jimmy, squatting in a house built by giants. I don't need this stage, or your cheap shots. I've got truth, and that's more than you'll ever have." The audience roared, their hands pounding together. A woman in the back, wiping tears, moved by the legend's resolve. Eastwood's words were a beacon, lighting up the room, exposing Kimmel as a shadow clinging to fleeting fame. Kimmel opened his mouth, but no sound came, his face crumpling like a man watching his world collapse. He sank into his chair, his hands limp, as the crowd's cheers drowned him out, their voices a tide sweeping him away. Eastwood turned, his gaze sweeping the audience, acknowledging their support with a slight nod, his face etched with quiet pride. He walked toward the stage's edge, his steps steady, unhurried, like a man who'd faced down a foe and left him broken. The crowd rose, their applause swelling, a tribute to a hero who'd defended his legacy against a petty tyrant. A man yelled, "We love you, Clint," as others clapped, their faces glowing, united in awe. As Eastwood reached the wings, he paused, looking back at Kimmel, who sat motionless, staring at the desk, a defeated figure dwarfed by the moment. The audience's roar followed Eastwood, their voices carrying beyond the stage, a testament to a man who'd stood for something real. Kimmel's show would go on, but this night belonged to Eastwood, a triumph of grit over glibness, of heart over hollow ambition. The crowd kept clapping, even as Eastwood vanished into the shadows, their cheers a promise that his legacy would endure, while Kimmel's taunts would fade, forgotten, like dust on an empty trail.